Something found you today. Maybe it was a video, a sentence, a stranger's offhand comment, a song that arrived at exactly the wrong moment and turned out to be exactly the right one. And some quiet part of you sat up, not because it was new information, but because it felt like a message written in your own handwriting, mailed to you by a version of yourself you haven't met yet. I want to talk about that feeling, about why certain moments seem to choose us. Here is something strange about being human. We spend most of our lives asleep while walking around wide awake. We eat, we work, we scroll, we perform the choreography of a life, and underneath it, a question waits. Not asked out loud, just waiting. Am I becoming who I actually am, or am I becoming who was easiest to become? Most people never hear that question clearly. It gets drowned out by deadlines, by the noise of other people's expectations, by the low hum of distraction we've built entire industries around. But every so often the noise drops out for a second, and in that silence, the question gets loud enough to hear. That's what's happening right now. I think about a seed buried in soil, in complete darkness, no sense of sky, no proof that light even exists, and yet something in it turns upward anyway, not because it can see the sun, because it's built to reach, even without evidence. We call that instinct in a plant. In a person we call it hope, or faith, or sometimes just stubbornness, but it's the same architecture. Something in you is built to reach toward a life you cannot yet see, and the ache you feel, that restlessness, that sense of being almost somewhere, that's not a malfunction. That's the seed remembering it's supposed to grow. Here's what almost nobody tells you about transformation. It rarely feels like inspiration. It feels like grief first. Because to become someone new, you have to let an old version of yourself die a little. The version who tolerated less than they deserved. The version who mistook comfort for peace. The version who confused being needed with being loved. Growth asks you to walk past a mirror and not recognize the person staring back, and to keep walking anyway. That's terrifying. Of course it's terrifying. You're not just changing your habits, you're changing your identity. And identity guards itself like a fortress, because for a long time that identity is the only thing that kept you safe. But safety and aliveness are not the same thing. A person can be perfectly safe and quietly disappearing. Think about the stories that have outlasted centuries, the ones about a hero who leaves the village, faces the dragon, crosses the underworld, and returns changed. We tell that story again and again, in every culture, in every language, because it isn't really about dragons. It's about the fact that meaning is never handed to us in the comfortable room. It's found in the leaving, in the risk, in the willingness to be temporarily lost. You are, right now, somewhere in that story. Maybe you're standing at the edge of the village, hand on the door, telling yourself it's not the right time. It's never the right time. That's not a sign to wait. That's just what the threshold feels like. Fear, by the way, is not your enemy in this. Fear is just love for your own life, misfiring as caution. It wants to keep you exactly as you are, because as you are has kept you alive this long. Fear cannot tell the difference between the fire that will burn you and the fire that will forge you. That distinction is something only you can make, with courage, not certainty. Courage was never the absence of fear. It was the decision that something else, a truth, a person, a purpose, matters more than the fear does. There's a kind of loneliness that comes right before a breakthrough, not because people have left you, but because you're outgrowing conversations, environments, even versions of relationships that used to fit. That ache isn't punishment. It's proof you're moving. Trees don't apologize for outgrowing the pot they were planted in. They just grow until the walls can no longer hold them, and something has to give. Something in you is asking to give. I want you to consider something that sounds almost too simple to be profound. You are not behind. There is no universal clock that everyone else is somehow reading correctly while you've fallen off schedule. The timeline you're comparing yourself to doesn't exist. It's a story stitched together from other people's highlight reels and your own worst assumptions about yourself. Some flowers bloom in spring. Some bloom in late autumn, alone, in the cold, more beautiful for the contrast. Nature doesn't rush the oak to outgrow the fern. Why would you rush yourself to outgrow your own becoming? Here is the quiet, almost embarrassing truth beneath all of this. The video didn't find you by accident, and neither did this moment. Not because of some mystical force rearranging the universe on your behalf, but because you were already looking. Somewhere inside you, a question had already been asked, and your attention, without your permission, went searching for the answer. That's not magic. That's something better. That's you, already in motion, already becoming, long before you had the language for it. So here is the final thing I want to leave you with. You do not need to have your whole life figured out to take the next right step. You do not need permission to outgrow what no longer fits. You do not need to wait until the fear disappears, because it won't. It will simply become quieter than your reason for moving forward. The dragon was never there to stop you. It was there to prove, to yourself, that you could face something enormous and still keep walking. You were not sent this moment to feel comfortable. You were sent this moment to remember something you already knew and had simply, understandably forgotten. You are not too late. You are not too much. You are not too far gone to begin again. You are simply, finally, awake. And the life that's been waiting for you, the one just past the edge of your fear, is not asking you to be fearless. It's only asking you to take one honest step, right now, toward the person you have always been, underneath everything you were told to become. There is a particular kind of silence that only arrives uninvited. You don't schedule it. You don't prepare for it. It slips in through the cracks of an ordinary day, while you're washing a dish, waiting at a red light, half listening to a conversation you've had 100 times before, and suddenly the noise of your life drops away, just for a second, like a radio losing signal. In that gap, something in you becomes audible that usually isn't, not a voice exactly, more like a pressure. A question that's been standing behind a closed door for years, finally allowed to knock. Most of us live inside noise on purpose, even if we'd never admit it. Noise is comfortable. It's the notifications, the errands, the small emergencies we manufacture to avoid the large, quiet ones. Because if the day stays loud enough, we never have to sit across from the questions that actually matter. Is this the life I meant to build, or the one that simply accumulated while I was busy surviving? Am I moving towards something, or just moving? Noise lets us postpone the reckoning indefinitely. It's not weakness that keeps people busy. It's often self-protection. Stillness can feel like standing too close to a mirror that tells the truth. So when the silence does arrive, when something manages to slip past the noise and land directly in your chest, it rarely feels gentle. It feels like being caught, like something has seen through the performance you didn't even know you were giving. That's why certain words, certain images, certain strangers' stories can suddenly undo you in ways that seem wildly disproportionate to the moment. It was never really about the video, or the sentence, or the song. Those were just keys. What they opened was a door you had already been standing in front of, whether you knew it or not. This is the part worth sitting with. Nothing found you by chance. Attention is not passive. It is a compass, quietly pointing toward whatever we haven't yet resolved. Long before you could name what you were missing, some part of you had already started searching for it. In conversations, in books left unread on the nightstand, in the ache that showed up whenever life got too quiet to ignore. What looks like coincidence is often just recognition arriving late. You didn't stumble onto this moment. You were already walking toward it, one unconscious step at a time, long before your mind caught up to what your heart had already decided it could no longer avoid asking. That is why this moment feels different. Not because the universe rearranged itself around you, but because you finally stopped running loud enough to hear what had been true the whole time. The silence didn't interrupt your life, it revealed it. There is an old image worth returning to slowly. A single seed, buried beneath the surface of the earth, sealed off from every trace of light. It cannot see the sun. It has no memory of warmth, no evidence that a sky even exists above the darkness pressing in on all sides. And yet, without instruction, without proof, it begins to turn. Some quiet mechanism inside it strains upward, pushing through soil that offers no promises, guided only by something coiled into its own nature. We call this instinct when we see it in a plant. We rarely stop to ask what it means when we recognize the same pull in ourselves. Because that pull exists in you too. It shows up as restlessness on an ordinary Tuesday, as a longing you can't quite name for a life that feels closer to the truth of who you are, as the quiet, persistent sense that you are meant for something you haven't yet located, even though you couldn't draw a map to it if your life depended on it. That feeling is not confusion. It is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is the oldest instruction written into living things: grow toward what sustains you, even before you can prove it exists. Most of us have been taught to distrust anything we cannot verify in advance. We want the blueprint before we commit to the building. We want certainty before we take the leap, guarantees before we let go of what's familiar. But nothing alive actually operates that way. The seed does not wait for confirmation that light exists before it commits to reaching for it. It reaches first. The proof comes later, as growth, as leaves, as the slow, unmistakable evidence that the reaching was never blind. It was aimed, all along, at something real. This is the architecture beneath every meaningful transformation a person has ever gone through. Long before the breakthrough, before the new direction becomes clear, before the life you're building has any visible shape, there is only the reaching. Uncomfortable, uncertain, occasionally embarrassing, reaching. Faith is not the absence of doubt. It is the decision to keep growing upward anyway, especially when the darkness gives you nothing to hold on to but your own refusal to stop. What looks like darkness from where you're standing is not evidence of abandonment. It is simply the space where growth happens before it becomes visible to anyone else, including you. The seed does not experience its own unfolding as dramatic or symbolic. It simply keeps turning toward what it cannot yet see, trusting a pull it never had to understand in order to obey. That same pull is alive in you right now, whether or not you have language for it yet. An old, patient intelligence insisting, quietly and without apology, that you are built to reach toward the light, long before you have any proof that it's there. Almost no one warns you that transformation begins with a kind of mourning. We tell stories about breakthroughs as if they arrive wrapped in excitement, a sudden clarity, a burst of motivation, a triumphant turning point set to music. But that's rarely how it actually feels from the inside. Before the new version of you takes shape, there is usually a quieter, harder passage first, the slow, aching recognition that someone you used to be has to be released. And release, even when it's necessary, even when it's overdue, still feels like loss. Think about who you had to be to survive certain chapters of your life. The version of you who learned to shrink in rooms where your voice wasn't welcome. The version who mistook exhaustion for proof of worth. Who confused being chosen with being enough. Who accepted less because less was what was offered and you didn't yet know you were allowed to ask for more. That version wasn't weak. That version got you here. But the qualities that once protected you can quietly become the walls that now confine you. And no one ever tells you that outgrowing your own survival strategies can feel like betraying the very self that kept you alive. This is why growth so often arrives disguised as grief. You're not just changing a habit or adjusting a routine. You're dismantling an identity, one built carefully, sometimes over decades, often without your conscious permission. An identity does not release its grip easily, because for a long time it was the only shelter you had. So when you begin to change, some part of you will grieve the comfort of the old shape, even while another part of you is desperate to leave it behind. Both of those feelings can be true in the very same breath. There's a particular kind of disorientation that comes with looking in the mirror during this in-between stage and not fully recognizing who's looking back. Not because you've lost yourself, but because you're finally standing at the threshold of becoming someone truer, and truth often looks unfamiliar at first. We are so used to equating comfort with rightness that anything unfamiliar registers as danger, even when it's actually just growth wearing a disguise we haven't learned to recognize yet. This is the quiet, unglamorous work that precedes every real transformation, not the highlight reel moment of arrival, but the harder, slower process of letting an old self dissolve without rushing to replace it too quickly with something equally rigid. Grief in this context isn't a sign that something has gone wrong. It's evidence that something real is actually ending, which means something equally real has room to begin. The old self doesn't have to be rejected or shamed on its way out. It can be thanked. It did its job. It got you exactly as far as it could. And now, gently, without punishment or urgency, it's allowed to rest, so that whoever you're becoming next finally has enough space to stand up straight. Somewhere along the way, most of us absorbed the idea that fear is the enemy of courage, that brave people simply feel less of it, that the strong walk through danger untouched by the trembling the rest of us feel. But that's a misunderstanding of what fear actually is. Fear is not the opposite of love. Fear is love, misfiring in the wrong direction. It's the part of you that cares so deeply about your survival, your safety, your sense of self, that it will do almost anything to keep you exactly where you already are, even if where you are has stopped being where you want to stay. Fear doesn't distinguish between the fire that will destroy you and the fire that will forge you into something stronger. It only recognizes heat. It only recognizes risk. So it sounds the same alarm whether you're about to make a catastrophic mistake or about to take the bravest step of your life. This is why so many people mistake fear for a stop sign, when often it's simply a threshold marker, proof that you're standing exactly where meaningful change tends to happen. The absence of fear was never the requirement for courage. If anything, fear's presence is usually a sign that something important is finally at stake. Consider how strange it is that we expect fear to politely disappear before we're willing to act. We wait for the nervousness to subside, for the doubt to quiet down, for some perfect internal calm to arrive and grant us permission to move forward. But that calm rarely comes first. It comes after, as a result of having moved despite the fear, not as a precondition for moving at all. Courage was never about eliminating fear. It was always about deciding that something else matters more. A truth you can no longer ignore, a person you refuse to disappoint, a version of your life you're no longer willing to abandon just to stay comfortable. This reframing changes everything about how we relate to our own hesitation. Instead of asking, why am I still afraid? The better question becomes, what am I afraid of losing? And is that fear protecting something real, or simply protecting the familiar? Sometimes fear is wisdom, warning you away from genuine harm. But often, especially in moments of growth, fear is simply an old alarm system, still guarding a version of you that no longer needs that much protection. Learning to tell the difference isn't about bravado. It's about listening closely enough to your own fear to understand what it's actually trying to say, rather than obeying it by default. Because underneath every act of courage anyone has ever admired, there was fear standing right beside it. The whole time, refusing to fully leave the room. The bravery was never in its absence. It was in the quiet decision to keep walking anyway, fear included, because some things, some versions of your own becoming, are worth walking toward even while your hands are still shaking. There is a particular kind of loneliness that shows up right before a person changes, and almost no one prepares you for it. It doesn't feel like the loneliness of rejection or loss. It feels quieter and stranger than that. The sense of standing in a room full of familiar people, having a familiar conversation, and suddenly realizing that none of it fits the way it used to. Not because anyone did anything wrong, not because the people around you failed you, but because some part of you has already started moving toward a life those old conversations were never built to hold. This is one of the least discussed truths about growth. It doesn't just change your habits or your goals, it changes what you can tolerate. Jokes that used to make you laugh start to land differently. Relationships that once felt like home start to feel like borrowed rooms. Environments you used to move through without a second thought suddenly feel too small, too loud, too far from whatever you're quietly becoming. And because none of this loneliness comes with an obvious cause, it's easy to mistake it for something being wrong with you, rather than something finally becoming right. Nature offers a simpler way to understand this. A tree planted in a small pot will grow only as much as that pot allows, until eventually its roots have nowhere left to go. At that point, the tree doesn't apologize for outgrowing its container. It doesn't wait for permission to need more space. The roots simply keep expanding until something has to give. Either the pot cracks, or the tree stops growing to accommodate it. No one calls this betrayal. No one asks the tree to feel guilty for becoming too large for what once contained it. We understand, instinctively, that this is simply what living things do when they're finally thriving. And yet when it happens to us, we rarely extend ourselves the same grace. We feel guilty for outgrowing friendships that no longer challenge us. We feel disloyal for wanting more from a life that once felt like enough. We interpret our own expansion as a character flaw, instead of what it actually is, proof that something in us is finally growing at the rate it was always meant to. This is why the ache of that particular loneliness deserves to be understood differently. It is not punishment for changing. It is not evidence that you've become difficult, ungrateful, or impossible to please. It is simply what it feels like when your roots have outgrown the space that used to hold you, and your life hasn't caught up yet to match the size of who you're becoming. The discomfort isn't a signal to shrink back down to fit the old container. It's a signal that the container was only ever meant to be temporary, a place to grow for a while, not a place to stay forever, no matter how safe or familiar its walls once felt. There's a quiet cruelty in the way we've learned to measure our lives against an invisible schedule none of us actually agreed to. Somewhere along the way, we absorbed the idea that there's a correct age to have things figured out, a proper year to be settled, established, arrived, as if life were a train with a fixed timetable, and everyone else somehow received a copy of the schedule that never made it into your hands. So when your path doesn't match that imagined timeline, it's easy to conclude that you've fallen behind, that you're somehow late to your own life, running to catch a train that already left the station without you. But that timeline was never real to begin with. It was stitched together from fragments, other people's carefully curated milestones, a culture obsessed with visible markers of success, and your own harshest assumptions about what you should have accomplished by now. No one hands you this schedule directly. You absorb it slowly, through comparison, through scrolling, through quiet moments of measuring your unfinished chapters against everyone else's highlight reels. And highlight reels, by definition, only show the blossoming. They never show the years underground. Nature has never operated this way, and it's worth asking why we expect ourselves to. Some flowers open in early spring, eager and immediate. Others wait until late autumn, blooming alone in colder air, arguably more striking because of the contrast, because of everything they had to withstand to finally open. No one walks through a garden in April, points at an autumn blooming flower still gathering itself beneath the soil, and calls it a failure. We understand, instinctively, that different things bloom on different timelines, and that this isn't a flaw in the design, it's the design itself. Yet we rarely offer ourselves that same patience. We rush our own becoming as if slowness were evidence of inadequacy, as if a delayed bloom meant a lesser one. We compare our unfinished middle chapters to someone else's triumphant ending, forgetting that we're not even reading the same book, let alone standing at the same page. The oak does not envy the fern for growing faster. It simply grows the way an oak grows, slowly, deeply, built for permanence rather than speed. What if your timeline was never wrong? What if the years that felt like falling behind were actually the quiet, essential work of putting down roots strong enough to hold whatever you're about to become? Growth that happens beneath the surface doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform for an audience. It simply does the patient, unglamorous work of preparing you for a bloom that hasn't arrived yet but is already forming, cell by cell, beneath everything that looks from the outside like stillness. You are not late. You were simply never on the timeline you thought you were supposed to be following.